So, when dealing with Antifa and various other so-called anti-fascist groups, whether they be the Black Bloc, typically though not always anarcho-communist, or others such as the Marxist Unite Against Fascism, we find ourselves dealing with people who want to violently suppress the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly of certain individuals based on the idea that they are fascists, Nazis, white supremacists, or whatever else. In the case of the punching of Richard Spencer, the founder of the alt-right, a largely online European racial identitarian movement, white nationalist if you will, the question was raised, is it okay to punch a Nazi? The problem is that Richard Spencer isn't actually a Nazi. If you want to call him a Nazi in a kind of offhand derogatory kind of way, the poster boy Nazi or whatever, that's fine, but if we're getting into any kind of serious political discussion, this is unhelpful. It is necessary to look at the differences between the alt-right, the neo-Nazis, KKK, neo-Confederates and whatever else, and take a serious look at them. But that's another subject, I suppose. But more to the point, who else is a Nazi? In the case of Milo Yiannopoulos, someone who could be described as alt-light, former writer for the conservative outlet Breitbart, and more importantly a gay Jew obsessed with having sex with black men, calling him a Nazi is completely bizarre, though it seems his opponents have avoided that to some extent at least. He has, however, been called a white nationalist, and, even more strangely, so has the former leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, as have many others. There's an inherent tendency toward exaggeration here, if not complete distortion of their political opponents' views, but I'd rather concentrate on Spencer and others like him for now. By punching Richard Spencer, he was given attention that he wouldn't otherwise have had. He almost became a household name, with world-famous celebrities talking about him and referencing him, saying we should be taking it to the streets, punching people in the face if we feel threatened by their ideas, all said from the comfort of their Beverly Hills homes and flashy venues.
And when we are at a loss amidst the hypocrisy and the casual violence of certain individuals and institutions, we will, as per Chief Jim Hopper, punch some people in the face when they seek to destroy the least and the disenfranchised.
My question was, is it okay for a Nazi to punch you back? Of course, we've now crossed that line. Okay, Nathan Domingo isn't a Nazi either, but that's beside the point. It was inevitable that the other side respond defensively, most of which are simply free speech protesters, Trump supporters and others opposed to the likes of Antifa and authoritarian fanatics, with only a handful of outright among them. It was quite predictable the situation would escalate the way it did. So how do Antifa and others like them justify their actions? Well, their argument goes something like this. There may be some variations, but the general principle is the same. In Germany in the 1920s and 30s, the Nazis, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, had freedom of speech, expression, assembly, and consequently the NSDAP gained popularity and, as a result, Hitler was democratically elected, where he was able to remove democracy along with freedom of speech, assembly, expression, etc. This is often more bizarrely bolstered by a claimed quote from Hitler himself. The quote is normally presented like this: "Only one thing could have stopped our movement, if our adversaries had understood its principle, and from the first day smashed with the utmost brutality the nucleus of our new movement." There seems to be some variation, but that's pretty much as it is. The problem is that there seems to be no direct attribution to Hitler. The closest thing comes from David Edgar's 1976 play Destiny. The vast majority, if not all the people using the quote in this way won't be able to provide a direct source. The general spirit of what is being said remains the same, and more importantly, this meme filters out into individuals in an increasingly vague manner. It appears, however, that Hitler did say something vaguely similar to this, though this is a total misquote and pretty much says the exact opposite of what was intended. The quote seems to come from Hitler's closing speech at the 1933 party conference in Nuremberg. Andrew Bossom, on his Rubos blog, discovered this in a German book from the time. The attribution comes from a 12-page speech made by Hitler. Andrew translates this block of text, along with several others. Only one thing could have endangered this development. Had the enemy recognised the principle, gained clarity over these thoughts and avoided all resistance, or if they had destroyed the first germ of this new gathering with the utmost brutality on the first day. The quote is contracted, leaving out the critical part where Hitler stated that doing nothing would have stopped the movement. Secondly, on the first day is changed to from the first day. inferring that a sustained attack against the NSDAP could or would have stopped them, as opposed to stopping them at the first, quote, germ, which could easily be interpreted as a very first communication of thoughts between people, the first conversation, under which circumstances it would be virtually impossible to stop such a thing, as you'd literally have to have some kind of North Korean-style Orwellian state to quell any resistance at the first inception. This is all the consequence of quoting Hitler. You can't trust or rely on anything he really says. His quotes are full of inconsistencies, if not downright contradictions. Other instances of quoting him lead people to claim that Hitler was a socialist, Hitler was a capitalist, Hitler was an atheist, Hitler was a Christian, Hitler was a Roman Catholic, and so on, all with their own agenda, all of which attempt to claim Hitler held X beliefs and that's why he did what he did, begging the question that extreme measures must be taken, and it's no different here at all. This is clearly a romanticised gloat from Hitler, and should not be taken in any way seriously. As for the idea that freedom of speech allowed the NSDAP to rise and so they gained popularity, well, they did with some people, but this was at a time of extreme hardship and the Weimar Republic was treated very badly after World War I. Others would have been too scared to say or do anything. Another critical part of all this seems to be the implication that no one, or at least very few people, resisted the NSDAP at the time. Some did, of course. There was continued violence between the NSDAP, other factions, and communists. It is frequently claimed that this is all a result of Hitler being democratically elected. Well, no, he wasn't. This seems to be one of the most pervasive myths in modern political thought. After a series of elections, the NSDAP never gained more than 30% of the vote, and they did this through the use of political violence. There were several parties in the elections: the Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, the Catholic Centre Party, the Nationalist Party, the NSDAP, and several other minor parties. After the NSDAP and others rained havoc on the streets, martial law was implemented, removing, and you might want to think about this, almost all civil liberties from the German people. Corporations in general didn't like the NSDAP. However, Fritz Thyssen, a businessman, had been impressed by them since hearing a speech by Hitler opposing the Treaty of Versailles. Thyssen, who had donated large funds to the NSDAP, including 100,000 gold marks, the equivalent of $25,000 in 1923, Thyssen, along with Hjalmar Schacht, a banker, wrote a letter to Paul von Hindenburg, the President of Germany, as a means to get him to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. He also persuaded the Association of German Industrialists to donate 3 million Reichmarks to the NSDAP. As a result, von Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor, and Thyssen was of course duly rewarded. This is something that could never have happened in a properly functioning social democracy, nor could what subsequently followed. Hitler passing the Enabling Act along with various other forms of legislation, removing freedom of the press, empowering the state further and further, removing civil liberties and other rights, and eventually appointing himself President and Führer, and abolishing democracy. None of these things could happen in the modern-day United States, or the United States at any time for that matter. The problems all go back to the end of World War I, where Germany fought a war beyond any point a war should be fought. The German Navy were ordered to go on to what amounted to a suicide mission, leading to a sailors' revolution, which led to the overturn of Kaiser Wilhelm II. This led Germany to experience terrible economic and social upheaval, along with various ill-conceived measures to deal with it. The Weimar Republic was a basket case from the beginning, and there were too many other things to go into. And why are we talking about 1930s Germany anyway? All of these things happened in a different time and place under distinctively different conditions. The argument made by anti-fascists is that somehow, if we don't smash the Nazis now, there will be, or could be, another genocide. The argument relies very heavily on an appeal to consequences fallacy. Richard Spencer et al. Have a vaguely, very vaguely similar philosophy to the NSDAP and Hitler. They see Spencer as Hitler and the modern-day US as 1930s Germany. If I concede that there is some extremely remote possibility of an authoritarian right-wing takeover, followed by a genocide, then I should also conclude that anyone who passes me in the street potentially wants to stab me. I should then preemptively kill or maim them to avoid this. Then, taken to its logically extreme conclusion, we should abort all babies for the fear that one day one of them might grow up to be the next Hitler. For that matter, genociding the entire human race may be a way to stop such an atrocity. The argument also relies on the historically determinist premise that the alt-right hold views similar, the same as, or kind of sort of like the views of the Nazis, so necessarily the same course of events will take place the same as before, which strangely ignores other right-wing authoritarian regimes and active groups that have existed. Some so-called anti-fascists may be deluded enough to think that they are fighting the rise of Nazi Germany 2.0. Others are simply looking for an excuse to violently suppress the beliefs of those they disagree with, and given the vagueness and conflations made, potentially anyone could be attacked. Others are not that politically interested, they just want to be involved in violence for some supposed cause, though these people function as useful idiots, and possibly Antifa et al. Are a useful tool for the establishment, and whoever is in power may not matter that much at all.